Well, good morning, everyone. It is a delight to be here with you today and to participate in yet again the annual Everett Parker Lecture. And certainly this year's lecture really needs no introduction. However, it's just my joy and pleasure to introduce him. Over the last half century, the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson has been recognized as one of the nation's leading civil rights, religious, and political figures. He walked with Martin Luther King Jr. and with Everett Parker. He shares years in Chicago, as well as a degree from Chicago Theological Seminary, a seminary of the United Church of Christ. In 1971, Reverend Jackson founded Operation PUSH, People United to Serve Humanity, in that city. Its goals were economic empowerment and expanding educational, business, and employment opportunities for the disadvantaged and people of color. In 1984, Reverend Jackson founded the National Rainbow Coalition, a social justice organization based in Washington, D.C., devoted to political empowerment, education, and changing public policy. 16 years ago, those two organizations merged to continue their work under the banner of the Rainbow PUSH Coalition. It's particularly appropriate for us to have Reverend Jackson speak to us this year, because he was twice a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, first in 1984 and then again in 1988. That year, he captured 6.9 million votes and won 7 primaries and 4 state caucuses. In 1991, Reverend Jackson was elected as the first so-called shadow senator from the District of Columbia. He held that post until 1997, working with others to highlight the fact that D.C. residents still lack full representation in Congress. He has won many awards over the years, including, and it's worth noting today, the 1997 Everett Parker Award presented by the Minority Media and Telecommunications Council. In August 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded Reverend Jackson the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. On that occasion, the president said these words, which resonate for me today as we gather for another Parker Lecture. From the founding of our nation, it has been the duty of each generation to achieve freedom all over again, to expand it, to deepen its meaning, to widen the circle of those who are included as full citizens. That day, the president specifically recognized Reverend Jackson for his, quote, keen intellect and loving heart, unquote. I steal yet another line from President Clinton on that day when he said, "You are now about to witness one of the best things about this ceremony. I don't have to follow Jesse Jackson." Well, at the conclusion of Reverend Jackson's speech, he is willing to respond to questions from the audience. So we'll have an opportunity to dialogue with him, and this will be an interactive morning. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, here to deliver the 30th Annual Everett C. Parker Ethics in Telecommunications Lecture, the Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Good morning. I am I'm especially delighted to receive this honor today, this huge giant force for justice in our time. Thank you, Dr. Black, for such a kind and generous introduction. To you, Attorney Trigg, for your life's work and what you mean to us. To Charles and Marge Benton, it should have been presented to both of them. See such a force for justice, and I want to thank the Benton family for being so decent. The huge sense of dignity across the years. We do not take your goodness for granted, all that you mean to us. The FCC commissioners, past and present, the Rainbow Push director in D.C., Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, please stand. Reverend Murphy, People's Congregational Church. Give him a hand, please, Brother Murphy. And to our Rainbow Push telecommunications director here in Washington, Bishop Steve Smith. Won't you please stand, Steve? I am a member of the United Church of Christ, CTS class, long-standing, I might add. It took me 30 years to graduate. I did fairly well the first 2 years under Dr. Howard Schomer and Ross Snyder and Dr. Obenhouse and that group. And then the movement struck a chord, a nerve in Selma that Sunday afternoon. And we decided to go down to Selma. Dr. Schomer said we should not go, we should stay in school and study. We rebelled and we went anyhow. He's the first one we saw when we arrived. And then Dr. King said to me after we had met and had begun to work in Chicago that I should join his staff and work with him, to travel with him across the country and the world. I said, I can't do it. I'm trying to finish seminary. I have 6 months to go. And I've not done well in my preaching class. I got an I for incomplete. Had not finished my counseling work. He said, well, you'll learn more seminary with me in 6 months than you will in the school in 6 years. I said, easy for you to say you have your PhD. He said, well, you just think about it. And I went and told my wife, Jackie, and Dr. Schomer. They said, well, you should go with him. Don't miss this moment. So I left CTS and got my degree 30 years later after Jesse Jr. had finished CTS. And so I want to thank Dr. Thistlethwaite and Dr. Alice Hunt for being generous enough to allow me to finally finish seminary, even though I have this complex about having flunked my preaching course at CTS. In honor to be with you this morning in this historic place to live the 30th annual Everett Parker Ethics and Telecommunications Lecture in this Dr. Parker centennial year, and our journey, which is even more difficult today. In this journey, we are now free, but not equal. And so in the freedom with the cutback on equality, our burden is even heavier today than it has been in the last few years. The pendulum has swung in a major way backwards. Retreat, reaction, and a reverse swing of rights under so much challenge by the Fort Sumter Tea Party ideology. In this quest from freedom to equality, too few own too much, and too many own nothing. Every moment has thousands of individuals whose names we never know, forming its backbone. The civil rights movement, for instance, was the product of countless individuals standing and working together throughout the South and across the country. There are always those individuals who emerge to give a face to a movement, provide leadership, vision, and moral authority. In the area of media reform was Dr. Everett Parker. He's been honored and described in many ways. Henry Rivera called him the conscience of the broadcast industry and the Federal Communications Commission. When Dr. Parker retired in 1983, Broadcasting Magazine described him as the founder of the citizen movement of broadcasting, who spent some 2 decades irritating and worrying the broadcast establishment. I could go on, but most often, and particularly for those who are deeply familiar with his work, he is known simply as the father of the media reform movement. His commitment to the public interest, his tenacity in addressing injustice, his courage in standing up to entrenched interests, be they racist social structures in the South or discriminatory corporate structures in New York and across the country, led a career full of accomplishments that we marvel at today. As Sam Simon has observed, ascertainment, broadcaster citizen agreements, equal employment opportunity, personal attack response time, minority ownership, fairness doctrine, equal time, diversity of ownership, license renewal, localism, and other crucial public interest safety net concepts all have their roots in the initial work of Everett Parker. Thousands of women and minorities working in the media today owe their careers to the work he did. In the beginning was the Word. No word, no world. Cut off the Word, you cut off the world. When you close the press, you cut off the Word in order to maintain control. I was in a country in Africa not long ago. The dictator at the helm, he closed the press and only allowed the state press, in full deference to him, to speak. He controlled the minds of the population. Tyrants cut off radio, banned books, and closed libraries. In slavery, it was illegal to read, to learn to read, to write, or to speak. You undermine democracy when you cut off voice. So even democracy allows the world begrudgingly when they control so tightly access to communications. We went to Gambia a few days ago. 9 people have been executed. 38 more were scheduled to die just this past Friday. We immediately called the president's office and asked for a meeting. His foreign minister called back. He allowed such a meeting with appeal for him to declare a moratorium on and not kill the 38 persons still on death row, and to release 2 Americans held in prison there and 2 Gambians. He agreed to do so. We were able to bring the 2 Americans back home, and the 38 off of no longer on death row. But only Fox pushed the story. CNN picked it up from Fox. Neither CBS, nor ABC, or CBS has touched the story yet. After a personal appeal, a Politico picked it up on Friday. New York Times did an article on Saturday. We had to push the story wholesale as if we were hustling some good. These media acts did not cover that story. And so when millions are left in the dark and cannot get the word out, it limits their world and their life options. The civil rights movement and the media reform movement shared the same backbone. The media reform movement grew out of the broader social justice movement of the time. While Parker had been an effective activist and advocate for the public interest long before the ferment of the 60s, the meeting with Dr. King and Dr. Parker, the Montgomery bus boycott, that put him on the path to his most noteworthy and transformational accomplishment, the license challenge against WLBT-TV in Jackson, Mississippi. At the meeting, Dr. King complained about how blacks were being treated on radio and TV stations in the South. King's concerns meshed with ideas that Dr. Parker was shaping on how to bring about change in a system that was closed to those it was licensed to serve. Even today, the media projects blacks and Latinos as less intelligent than we are, less hardworking, less universal, more violent, and less worthy. The story of the WLBT license challenge has been told many times. It was a lengthy, multi-year battle that resulted in the landmark court decision that gave the radio public standing before the FCC, led to revocation of the WLBT's license. The first time a station had been punished for failing to serve the public interest. Ultimately, it led to an ownership group that reflected the Jackson community, which was 40% African American at the time, and nationally, it changed the way for broadcasters doing business everywhere. WLBT TV, an example of what Dr. King talked about, one of many. Discrimination in hiring, in programming, practices, in news coverage. You all know the stories. Blackened and out-programmed segments that featured African American performers on news items that challenged the racist status quo. There was even a white supremacist bookstore on the station premises. So Parker's WLBT battle was not about abstract legal practices. It's about core principles of justice, equality, and fairness in our primary medium of mass communication. The medium through which we tell our stories, determine what's important, get our news, and express our values. Parker's core idea was so simple. The airways belong to the people, that the people have a right to express their views. Between the simple idea and the final court decision was years of hard work in the field and in the office, researching, organizing, strategizing, and fundraising, which Dr. Parker pursued with his characteristic tenacity. And why? He was driven by a sense of justice and morality. It was not easy to do organizing work in the South. The possibility of violence against Dr. Parker was great. He faced death threats and harassment, but he persevered. And because he did, citizens gained access to the FCC. Legal standing was unleashed a wave of grassroots public interest initiatives across the country, the birth of the media reform movement. Dr. Parker pursued the WLBT case through his role as founding director of the Office of Communications of UCC, an organization that continues to be at the forefront of media reforms efforts here even today. We must all recognize the role of UCC in both media reform and the broadcast civil rights movement today. The denomination was active in the very early stages of the movement, a strong ally to those engaged in the work day to day, including, lest I say, the March on Washington. Beyond WLBT, Dr. Parker, through the Office of Communication, brought a moral perspective to key media policy debates of the time, always in the thick of the fray. He spearheaded the effort to open up employment opportunities in broadcasting for women and people of color. Office of Communication petitioned the FCC to take action. Commission issued a report and order on equal employment opportunity in 1971, creating policy that began to open up the industry and create a richer and more diverse media environment. He worked with leading media companies, established training programs for minority young people, and secure commitments to hire them. In terms of diversity, there's still a long way to go, particularly in the area of ownership. Dr. Parker recognized early on that the most powerful tool of communication in a democracy must reflect the diversity that encompasses democracy and ownership. All voices must be heard. All people must have equal opportunity to participate at all levels of the media industry. Dr. Parker was a willing mentor, being the one who shared his vision for justice and fairness, something many in this room can attest to. He inspired a generation of young people, clergy, activists, and professionals with his tenacious belief that we can change things if we but act and talk. In our democracy, mass media must be open to an array of values, lifestyles, and ideas. He could not be with us today. In many ways, he may very well be with us today, watching us online. Let's express our appreciation right now. Let's give Dr. Parker a big hand. On your feet, show your love for him right now. Dr. Parker's friend and associate Ralph Jennings said Parker advocated examining the needs of society before dancing to the broadcaster's tune. Look at the issues facing us today in terms of media and telecommunications policy. It's important that we examine the needs of society and make decisions based on the public good, not the corporate demand. Look at the things they are today. Become clear that communications issues are civil rights issues. ownership, for instance. Media outlets are business opportunities, but they are so much more. They provide access to the American conversation, direct attention, and shape consciousness. They witness to the world. For the last 30 years, we've witnessed an unabashed media consolidation facilitated by the FCC. There's been a reduction in unique voices, a reduction in opportunities to participate in the American debate, the loss of diversity of ideas for the American people, as well as the loss of business opportunities for women and people of color in this billion-dollar ad campaign for who will be our next leader. However, the effects that have perhaps been felt most severely in radio. If you ever wish to visit one of those urban stations we call radio factories, you'll get my point. Usually a nondescript building, isolated from the community, the long hallway with many doors. Behind each door is a radio station. 5, 6, 7 or more stations in one building, one sales staff, one news team, and always one owner. 5, 6, 7 or more stations in a market that carry different programming, but ultimately speak with one voice, that of the owner, often a corporate giant with headquarters far from the city of service. Tell me, how can it possibly be in the public interest to have 9 radio stations with one owner in a market the size of Modesto, California? For minorities, local politics are critical. Everyday battles are being fought over budget allocations, school issues, public services, and scores of matters that affect the local quality of life. Local media is critical to this process. Very little of that media is controlled by women and minorities. The minority ownership that does exist has been rapidly shrinking over the past few years. Looking to the past decade, data shows that from October 2006 to 2007, the number of minority-owned commercial TV stations decreased by 8.5%. African-American TV station ownership dropped by 60%. Today, minorities make up about 37% of the U.S. population. Data shows minority media ownership, commercial TV station is around 3%. Women, 51% of the population, own around 6%. Radio ownership for these groups is only slightly higher. Minority audiences being served, a minority voice is being heard? I think not. Recent studies claim that African-American-owned radio stations reach 5.3% of the African-American households in the U.S. Hispanic and Latino-owned stations reach just 21.7% of Latino households. Asian American-owned stations reach just 24% of the Asian American households. I suspect the numbers regarding African American ownership, in fact, has gotten worse the last few years. So it should come as no surprise that content on local stations rather serves the needs of minority audiences and their communities. Diverse voices are not heard, issues are covered from one perspective. The FCC facilitated this level of media consolidation, and they can make changes that will encourage diversity and open up the system again. There was a brief period of time when policies were implemented, more than minority ownership. In 1978, the FCC adopted 2 policies, distress sales and tax certificates. Distress sales permitted broadcasters to escape a hearing by selling their audience stations to minorities for a 25% discount. Remember that when radio was developed in 1919, they gave all stations the white males only by lottery. And then 48 TV, all stations of white males only by lottery, 17 years before the right to vote. When they could sell what was given at a discount, we saw a rise in ownership. Tax certificates enable broadcasters selling stations to minorities to postpone capital gain taxes. Sounds like a big number. As David Honig has pointed out, those 300 stations represented just 1% of the broadcasting industry's asset value. In 1995, Congress repealed the tax certificate option, the first act led by Newt Gingrich. Cut voice, cut rural, cut word, cut politics. The tax certificate program was effective in expanding minority ownership. It's certainly worth considering again today. In these difficult times with record poverty and unemployment numbers, healthcare battles, a crisis in education, so many structural problems facing us, the challenge of communication need to be opened up again. We need more diversity of ideas and voices. More people need more access to our mainstream channels of communication. Perhaps more importantly, we need to get to know one another. That's what Dr. King and Dr. Parker were about. The King spoke of the beloved community, the possibility of social justice abiding. We must get to know each other. Broadband is a civil rights issue. In fact, MMTC has called it the top civil rights issue of the 21st century, precisely because the technology is being positioned, should I say, as a primary driver of economic opportunity and a catalyst for social change. The world is moving online. Once again, poor African American and Hispanic households are being left behind. The digital divide continues to be real. Every day, more and more basic functions are moving online. Business, education, medical, even social services. The threat of falling through the cracks, being left behind, outside the reach of the safety net are real and more real every day. As the MMTC puts it, the digital haves are first-class digital citizens with a passport to explore all the internet has to offer. The digital have-nots are second-class citizens trapped in poverty without access to opportunities offered in the digital economy. The data tells us that more than half of all African Americans and Hispanic households have yet to adopt broadband at home. The situation is even more serious for adults, even more so for our children. If we don't deal with this divide, we run the risk of relegating the whole generation of young people to the fringe of society. It's true. 64% of African Americans use mobile applications online. African American teens are at the forefront of that group. But there are limits to what can be accomplished on your iPhone Droid. They're great for playing Angry Birds, but not for doing research papers or filling out college applications. Census Bureau data shows that African Americans and Hispanic children use internet and at school much more regularly than other children, probably because they don't have broadband at home. There's already an education gap in America. Research shows that African American and Hispanic children lag 2 to 3 years behind white students of the same age. Chicago, 160 schools do not have a library. 140 in the black and brown communities. 400,000 children, 325 households without a piano or a music or art class or a band. 55% of Latino students, 51% of blacks, and half of Native Americans earn a high school diploma, compared to over 75% of white children. Access to broadband at home and school is not the magic bullet that will solve this problem. Let's go a step further. Reaching poor and minority communities with broadband must be a priority. Groups like One Economy and Broadband Opportunity Coalition are taking up the challenge, and some business enterprises have joined in, offering discounted rates and hardware to make it happen. A word about Lifeline. Finding ways to make broadband affordable. Covering service and equipment costs, educating users will take some time. Penetrating our inner cities and reaching those in rural, isolated settings present challenges that we're still in the process of working through. The answer is not right around the corner. Beyond Lifeline, this issue of the prison. The American justice system has gone awry. Prison telephone service is a civil rights issue. We lead the world in imprisoned citizens. 2.5 million Americans in federal and state prisons and jails today. 2 million citizens behind prison walls. The world's leading democracy with the world's largest prison population. And that population is overwhelmingly black, brown, and poor. For instance, the population of Georgia is 29% black, prison population 64%. Mississippi, 30% black, prison 76%. Pennsylvania, 10% black, prison population 56%. Ratios similar across 50 states. These primarily young black and brown Americans are ripped from familiar surroundings and isolated from loved ones. If they're to return to society as productive citizens, they need the support of those who care about them. They need to communicate with those who love them. The prison phone systems have been designed to exploit prisoners and their families. This is not an accident. It didn't just happen. It's a system designed to prey on one of our most vulnerable populations. Prison phone service is a civil rights issue, a moral issue. It's about how we respond to the least of these. Visits to incarcerated family members are difficult for the poor. Transportation and accommodation. Visits are an economic burden. The phone becomes the only way to maintain communication. Mothers and fathers with their children, wives and husbands, brothers and sisters. Instead of recognizing the important role telephone service plays in shaping the inmates' lives, the role it plays in maintaining the few supportive relationships many inmates have, prison administrators and state legislators view it as a revenue source. The folks paying are those who can least afford it. Prisoners cannot choose their carrier. In many cases, telephone companies bid for the right to provide service to a prison, and the company offering the best deal for the prison, not the prisoners. It's corrupt. They get the contract. Phone service has become a profit center for the prison, and the families and friends of prisoners pay the burdensome bills. In this day of pennies a minute phone rates, and unlimited long-distance plans, families can pay a connection charge of $3 or more plus per minute. Rates approaching $1, making a 15-minute collect call anywhere from $10 to $17 or more. A weekly 1-hour call can cost families up to $300 a month. These rates are predatory. For families already struggling to make ends meet, this is an unconscionable burden. Imagine having to choose between putting food on the table or accepting a call from a family member in prison, a choice no family should have to make. For 10 years now, the FCC has ignored police to fix this situation. Martha Wright, an elderly woman who had to choose between paying for medicine, calling her grandson in prison, petitioned the FCC to solve this problem almost a decade ago. These high rates cannot be justified. 8 states and the Federal Bureau of Prisons have already made some changes. The men and women in our prisons need supportive networks when they are released, and that must happen. They must maintain communications with loved ones while they're incarcerated. The FCC must put an end to this madness. I want to thank you today for allowing me to share with you. I look forward to something different. I went to several major conventions this summer, and neither one had a telecom conference such as this. If too few know so much and share so little, we've defeated ourselves. We must convene the broader body of churches. They might see this as a moral issue, consistent with the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among the people. I thank you today for allowing me to be a part of this session. Thank you so much. It seems to me organizing the affected people is the first. There are ministers and denominations have no idea this group exists, whose direct interest would be we need a 5,000 people march on the FCC. We might get the nation's attention. I mean, can you imagine that we are able to go to the Gambia where 9 people have been killed? That made the news. Savages killing 9 people. 38 people were spared. Well, we asked the governor of Georgia to not kill Troy Davis, and he did not spare. The governor of Oklahoma did not kill Wanda Gina Allen, he did not spare. The governor of Perry of Texas to stop killing, he has not spared. We were able to get a leader to spare 38 lives and let 2 Americans come home. It was not network worthy. It's an issue. I watched the coverage, by and large, Lamel, on Chicago school strike, when framed union versus board, charter versus public. But in that, the issues of inequality, poverty, and violence have been made illegal to discuss. You cannot strike over inequality, poverty, but you can strike over recall the teacher been part of recall and a part of a reevaluation. What am I saying? If you go beyond union versus non-union, 160 schools without a library, 140 of them south of North Avenue. In the same system, you have select schools as in Peyton High and Whitney Young, select schools, where they have foreign language and math and chemistry and physics and the like. Then you have charter schools without athletic teams and music or art. Then you have the rest of them. You have some provisions for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but nothing for the rest of them. The gap is wider than it was in Little Rock in 1957. But not one TV station is going to say Whitney Young compared to, would say, Marshall High. So people can see the difference. And these kids take the same exam. If you say Marshall High plays Whitney Young High in basketball, why can Marshall High do as well? Because the playing field is even. Rules public, goals clear, referees fair after last night sometime. And the score is transparent. And so we know it's one ball. We know the circumference of the rim. We know it's 10 feet from the floor. Based on one set of rules, kids who are behind can make up. If you ask the same, let's go, when back to school did not mean the same thing for Marshall it meant for Whitney Young. And yet inequality seems not to matter. As if ownership seems not to matter. Ownership does matter. And getting laws in place to revive ownership. If Gingrich took it away, we should not take it back. We must provide more ownership. Thank you very much. Lastly, yes, ma'am. Expand it for me. I don't know what you're talking about. Expand it for me, please. I believe so. I think broadband is too important to be to the highest and slickest bidder. I think everybody should have access to broadband, the lifeline, that we should revive a commitment to tax credits and some incentives for ownership. That should happen to all of us. Let me say to you today in closing that this is National Voter Registration Day. The stakes are incredibly high. This divide they speak of is not just a political divide. This is an ideological divide. This is not the Tea Party. This is the Fort Sumter Tea Party. Its roots are in segregation, sedition, slavery, and retreat. Its anti-female options, anti-civil rights, anti-worker options have deep roots in the Civil War, with uncivil behavior one toward the other. And I struggle for a one big 10th America, for all the in and on out. The stakes are incredibly high. I urge us to know this time around what is the most anxious feeling I have is that the winner could lose and the loser could win because of a commitment to transparent thievery. 1,100,000 purged in Ohio, 1 million purged in Pennsylvania, 500,000 purged in one who must now re-register. This is an open attempt to undermine the promise of our democracy. It doubles our work. And let me say kind of what it means to us as we grapple with democracy at home, and I close. Our embassy have been trying to get the two Americans who were in prison in the Gambia, have been working diligently. But they couldn't make the case of his sovereign right to kill people because our states argue their sovereign right to kill people in their state. Our embassy ambassador could not make the case of don't execute because they saw Troy Davis killed in real time. We couldn't make that case. We couldn't make the case in Gambia, our embassy could not, about unnecessary jailing because of the false arrest here. So our local policy bankrupted our foreign policy, undermine our moral authority. We were able to make an appeal on a kind of third rail, a kind of, we don't represent the government. We represent an idea of dignity, and we hope that you will appreciate our moral appeal. He said, I'll release them to your delegation of ministers on this basis. The U.S. does not have the moral authority to speak of false arrests and executions. We must regain that authority for our nation. Thank you very much.